Okay, AP Euro Scholars for our review on Unit 6, the French Revolution and Napoleon. Some thoughts on the review sheet, looking at it from top to bottom. You should be familiar with the impact of the Enlightenment on the Revolution. Some thinkers that tie in very nicely here. John Locke, remember his ideas that men are born with natural rights and they create government to protect their rights. They have the right to change their government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that we are born free, but we find ourselves in chains, namely the chains of absolute monarchy and the Catholic Church, and that we should create a government that comes from and is subject to the general will, the will of the people. Voltaire, remember he's famous for his support of free expression, and he is an ardent opponent of the Catholic Church. Remember the phrase, crush the infamous thing. And Montesquieu, in the spirit of the laws, is an advocate of divided government. He's looking across the channel at England and looking at good government is divided between a legislature and a monarch whose powers are limited. Some non-philosophical causes of the French Revolution. Keep in mind here, right before the revolution in 1789, a date you have to know, are bad harvests and a very high price of bread, creating tension, especially in the cities. You have the high debt, which will no longer be financed by those loaning money to Louis XVI, and this debt is in part the cost of Versailles, but more so the cost of a series of wars. The disastrous war, the 7 Years' War, in America called the French and Indian War, where France loses basically its real estate in North America, Canada, and Louisiana. And the French do get the revenge against the Brits by supporting the American revolutionaries, but this just adds to the debt. And this all comes to a head in 1789 when the French king needs more money, and he has to call the nobility, who have it, into the session of the Estates General after 175 years of not having met for close to 2 centuries. The Cahiers de Doléances. This is a list of grievances brought to the Estates General, and it is a list of complaints about having been shut out and the corruption of the government. And the 3 estates of France that are called to the Estates General. Remember, the first estate is the clergy. The second estate are the nobility. This is 4 to 5% of the population of France, and they control most of the wealth, but they do not pay taxes. The remainder of France, some 95% more or less, are bearing the entire burden of the taxation, and about 80% of this remaining 95% are peasants. But that other 20% of the third estate are the bourgeoisie. These are the people that are living in the growing cities. At the very bottom, you have your day laborers, and these are going to be, in part, the sans-culottes, who are going to be sort of the muscle power behind a lot of the revolutionary action. In Paris, you have your artisans, your shopkeepers, your tailors and carpenters, and those sort of people. And then you have your professionals, and these would be your merchants, these would be your bankers and businessmen and lawyers. And these are those who are aspiring to more power, to more position, to have access to the patronage which is being hogged by the first and second estates. The grievances of the third estate, again, is this idea that the third estate should participate some way in the government of France, and they're being outvoted by the 2 groups in the third estate, the first and second. So there's going to be this request, this demand, to vote by head, by individual, rather than by group. And the third estate is going to be shut out of the Estates General, and they are going to move to an adjacent tennis court, and they're going to take this famous oath in which they say they're creating a new National Assembly, and they're looking for people, they get sympathizers, they get allies from the first and second estate, not a lot of them, but enough, and they're saying they will not disband until they have a new constitution. And you see this in the famous painting by Jacques-Louis David, who is a neoclassical painter, and the tennis court oath, in which the third estate members in this National Assembly in this tennis court are portrayed as the new Romans. They're supposed to be they look like another painting that David did called The Oath of the Horatii. And these are these Romans, Republican Romans, that are sort of saluting their swords, and they're going off to die to protect the freedom of the Republic. It's a little about what these revolutionaries saw themselves as doing. They're standing for freedom against an unjust system and an unjust king. And in this painting, you see light pouring through the windows. You see a breeze blowing the curtains. Light, of course, represents reason, perhaps that breeze, the reform, and the government of free men that's in the process of being created. The Bastille is this fortress in Paris that the mob attacks and takes over, and they do this after the king has ordered border troops to come to Paris. A lot of these troops are mercenaries, and the fear is he's going to crush them, and he's going to crush the National Assembly, which has the third estate representatives of Paris declaring this new government. The Women's March on Versailles. Remember, the AP is really big on feminist history, and in '89 you have this large group of women from Paris march on Versailles. They're looking for flour, they're looking for bread, they're looking for food. There's still hunger in Paris. Remember, there's been this horrible harvest. The price of bread is just soaring, and they're going to seize the king, the queen, and their son, the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy, and they're going to force them to come back to Paris, where they're essentially put under house arrest at the Tuileries Palace in the middle of Paris. Olympe de Gouges is the woman who writes the Declaration of the Rights of Women. It's a play on the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and she is an early French feminist. The civil constitution of the clergy is going to make the church a department of the state, of the French government. The clergy are going to be required to take an oath of loyalty to the French state, or lose their positions, lose their salaries, lose their pensions. The clergy are going to be voted on by the laity, by the French public, and all church property is confiscated by the French government, and monasteries and nunneries are shut down. A new constitution is created, and it's put into effect in 1791, and basically they're setting up a government like across the channel in Great Britain. You have a king that can veto laws, but the assembly can override. Now, it's important to note here, you don't go immediately from Estates General and Bastille to killing the King of France. You have what many history books call these two phases. The first phase is relatively moderate. You set up a constitutional monarchy. They keep the king, only he's limited. And then after France falls into a bloody war with basically the rest of Europe, you're going to have the declaration of a republic, and the king is eventually going to be tried and executed. But that happens later, not immediately. The Jacobins and the Girondists are both on the left wing of the assembly, and they're those who want a republic. They don't want a king at all. The Jacobins, their focus is on Paris. They want a strong central government. They want limits on the price of bread. They want price controls. They sort of represent the urban France. Whereas the Girondists are more focused on the provinces. They want a more decentralized government. They want towns on the fringes of France, such as Bordeaux, to have more of a say. And they are more pro-farmer. They want to see the prices lifted on bread to encourage more production and more profits for those who are growing the grain. And it's interesting, the Girondists are those who are going to push a declaration of war against Austria, which is sort of preemptively moving an army on the border of France and threatening to invade if anything happens to the Bourbon family. Remember, Marie Antoinette is an Austrian. She's an Austrian wife of Louis XVI. So keep in mind here, we're talking about Louis XVI, not to be confused with Louis XIV, who's the powerful king who creates Versailles. 1792, the September massacres. After war breaks out against Austria, there is also essentially a revolution or a civil war in the western France in what's called the Vendée, and over 1,000 prisoners are pulled out of the jails in Paris, and they are basically bludgeoned to death. And this precedes the Reign of Terror, but this shows there's this fear that France might get sort of stabbed in the back by disloyal opponents of the revolution. Some of these people are opponents, some of them are just suspects, but there's no trial. They are summarily executed. The levée en masse is the massive conscript army which will be raised in France, which will be effective in turning back the invasion of a Prussian and Austrian army. The émigrés, these are the nobles who flee France. Some 20,000-ish flee, and many of them are joining and supporting invading armies. Robespierre is Maximilien Robespierre is the leader of the Committee of Public Safety, which is an emergency dictatorial group which he's going to seize power over. And they are at the sort of the height of the revolution, with all these countries invading France and civil war in the Vendée and in some of the cities like Lyon and Marseille. This fear, this paranoia of counter-revolution behind the backs of the armies of France. Robespierre is going to launch what's called the Reign of Terror, and tens of thousands are going to die in under the guillotine, as there is attempt to snuff out disloyalty and to what Robespierre calls creating a republic of virtue, those who want virtue, but not just those who are quiet about their problems with the revolution. The de-Christianization of France takes place under the Reign of Terror, under Robespierre, and they create a new calendar, and they rename the months of the year. They create a Temple of Reason out of Notre Dame. They murdered the clergy by the thousands. They changed the street names of Paris. All the saint names are gotten rid of. You can't name your kid after a Christian name, and churches are shut. And it's a very atheistic reign of terror against the Christian faith. Robespierre does set up what he calls the cult of the supreme being. He's not an atheist himself. In fact, he believes there has to be some sort of moral anchor, and it's going to be this sort of nature's God. It's going to be this supreme being, and there's a statue set up of this entity in Notre Dame, which is desecrated. Neoclassical art, again, is this art that promotes the idea of a free people rising up and grabbing their freedom, glorifying the revolution, glorifying the revolutionaries. And some of the paintings by David, the most famous of the neoclassical painters, the Tennis Court Oath, very familiar painting, the Oath of the Horatii, which is of these Romans going off to fight for their freedom. Looks very much like their swords being raised over their heads. Looks like all these guys at the tennis court raising their hands in this salute. Then the death of Marat. Remember, Marat, or in English, Marat, M-A-R-A-T, is this journalist. He is in charge of the People's Voice, and it's a newspaper which he would put the list of the names of those people who should die, and basically these people would be arrested and guillotined. And Charlotte Corday, who's a Girondist, is going to get an invite to interview him while he's in his medicinal bath, and she is going to stab him to death. And this painting makes Marat look like a martyr. It's supposed to make you think a little bit of the Pietà. Remember that statue with Mary with the dead Christ on her lap. Romantic art is art which is, it celebrates emotion in the individual, and it is in opposition to many of the values of the Enlightenment, that this focus on reason and the revolution that comes out of this focus on reason. And there's one painting, two paintings to know here, at least on my test. The 3rd of May, 1808, Francisco Goya. This is the Spanish painter of a scene where there's this French firing squad killing these Spaniards, and you see this artificial light being cast on the execution scene by a lamp. And this represents reason. This represents the horrible thing that's happened here. The Enlightenment has given birth to this French Revolution, which is spilling blood across Europe. And in the background of this painting, the church is in darkness. Remember, this is a period where the church has essentially been taken over and shut down, and priests and believers are being killed, and the calendar is being changed to get rid of Sunday and Christian holidays. And Goya is making a statement here about what he thinks about religion, which is necessary, and the French Revolution, which is an abomination. The Raft of the Medusa is a painting by Theodore Géricault, and it shows a true story of a shipwreck off the coast of Algeria, which is caused by an incompetent captain. And what you're supposed to do is read into this. You're seeing the incompetent captain is Napoleon, who's bringing great suffering on the French people through his invasions across Europe. Some differences and similarities between the English and French revolutions. The English Revolution has a pre-existing parliament which has over time asserted its rights and is reasserting its rights. The nobles in England do expect to pay, but they expect a say, and this is one of the reasons why there's rebellion against the king. Think of Charles in particular. And religion is involved in the English Revolution. You have the Parliament, which maybe disproportionately represents Protestant strongholds, such as cities rising up against the more Anglican, the more Church of England countryside aristocrats. And the English Parliament will win the English Revolution against Charles. He's going to be executed. Similarity here, although some religious motivations which are differences. And then there's a second rebellion against a parliament against James II, and he's 2 kings away from Charles I after Oliver Cromwell's Puritan dictatorship. And the parliament is going to unseat James II, but relatively bloodlessly. So just some thoughts to sort of sort through those. Russia is considered to be pretty much the reason why Napoleon's regime collapses. This massive army of 500,600,000 soldiers marches into Russia, is trapped by the winter. They capture Moscow, which is burned in a scorched earth tactic, and Napoleon's troops can't find food, they can't find fodder for their animals, they can't find warmth, and they're going to trudge back to France. They're going to be picked off by Russian guerrillas, and they're going to die of exposure. And about 90% of the French army will die in this retreat from Russia. And France is going to be defeated very badly in Germany at the Battle of Leipzig, and Alexander I is going to be leading a coalition army into the streets of Paris, and he will capture Napoleon, who is going to be sent to Elba off the coast of Italy. This is before a second exile to St. Helena in the South Atlantic. The Concordat under Napoleon is going to make peace between Napoleon and the church. He sees what happened here with the revolutionaries antagonizing Catholic France, and Napoleon is going to cut a deal where the church and state will share on the appointment of bishops. Not perfect from the Pope's perspective, but certainly better than the reign of terror against the church under Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. And Napoleon will agree to say that the Catholic Church is the religion of the majority of the French people, but the church does not get its property back, and other religions do have freedom of worship, and the Christian calendar is returned. Napoleon, how is he an enlightened ruler? He considered himself to be a son of the revolution. He is going to end feudalism in areas he takes over. He's going to spread religious freedom, and he's going to open government and trades up to the common man. And this is part of what's called the Code Napoleon. These values of the French Revolution will be spread across Europe, and he's not going to end them in France. He's going to keep them. And it's kind of ironic or contradictory that you have this man who is going to be a dictator, and then he's going to coordinate himself as emperor, but he is a believer in the equality of Frenchmen, certainly not French women, but he's going to believe in not reviving feudalism and keeping freedom of religion and opening government offices on the basis of merit. Waterloo is the site of the final defeat of Napoleon. This is a battle in Belgium between the French army and the Prussians and the English. And the Congress of Vienna is a meeting in Austria in 1815. The architect of the rearranging, the restoration of conservative Europe is Clemens von Metternich, and he's the foreign minister of the Habsburg monarch. And the 4 countries that meet are going to be the Austrians, the Prussians, the English, and the Russians. And the goal here is, think of 2 main things. One is legitimacy, putting the legitimate rulers back on their thrones, including a Bourbon on the throne of France. Very foresighted. It's going to be a conservative French ruler, Louis XVIII, who is the brother of Louis XVI. You may ask what happens to Louis XVII. Well, Louis XVII is a kid who's going to die in prison under mistreatment of the French revolutionaries. But legitimacy, putting conservative rulers back on the thrones, and to a balance of power, not letting future Napoleons, future Robespierres, future revolutionary France's upset the balance of power of Europe. So there you have it. There's our drive-by review. Study well. Good luck. Signing out.